Folks, we have a very interesting topic of conversation that I think has been gestating for a very long time in the PlayStation landscape, certainly for PS5, which is, has Sony lost their way? Now, this was a bit of a jumping off point from a recent episode of Pachter Factor with Michael Pachter from Wedbush Securities, where Pachter, I'm sure people have known him for a long time in the gaming business, where typically when you see a headline from Michael Pachter, it's because he says something that is often very outlandish, kind of crazy, or maybe he's saying something that you think, oh man, is he spitting? And so there's that disagreement, or maybe this time around he's saying something that makes a lot of sense, which I want to preface the whole thing by saying with Michael Pachter in particular, this is always something where he's got thousands of hours online from, things that he's said or talked about or discussed, whether they're on panels or Pachter Factor, but typically the way these things work is that he'll say something that is very outlandish, and then that gets picked up as headlines and then put out to the wider gaming sphere, the wider gaming audience, and then you're always seeing things that are just kind of weird and crazy and you disagree with them, and that's how people come to this conclusion of, oh, Michael Pachter, he's an idiot. Now, I'm not here to say that because I think that's always important to clarify. He's said a lot throughout the years, and it's not really fair to only ever be fed the things that you are probably going to disagree with. Typically, he's always somebody that is saying some fairly rational things, and so I just want to make that pretty clear. But I do disagree with a number of points he made recently in this episode of Pachter Factor, and so this was actually put out by a number of gaming sites, and most notably because there was one thing in there that he said that was incorrect, and so that had to be corrected, which was, basically to give you the recap here, so on this recent episode, he was talking about PlayStation's lack of first-party software output. So somebody sent that question in, and he was answering the entire thing at length and being very open, being very candid, even using some choice words for how Sony runs and how they're operating PlayStation nowadays. So he did say mistakenly that Jade Raymond was let go and Fair Games was canceled. Now, Fair Games is not canceled. As far as the Jade Raymond portion, we don't necessarily know that. That's one of those things where arguably you can see two directions of how that goes, which is she just left on her own accord, just established the studio, got it up and running. They're a few years into developing Fair Games, and maybe she just wanted to leave. That could be a possibility. I think the other more likely scenario is perhaps they weren't really reaching these milestone builds that they are trying to get to with Fair Games, especially after the live service output so far and how turbulent that's been, and now PlayStation's learning some hard lessons about that category of games, and so they're being a lot more stringent, a lot more picky with what they end up releasing, putting these games through a tougher cycle of review windows, and probably that was a byproduct of Jade Raymond having to go and then wanting to bring in more leadership. I would think the latter there is perhaps much more correct, but I'm also somebody that is never one to say with so much conviction of, oh, that's definitely what happened, when quite frankly we just simply don't know that, right? Until it comes out from Jade herself or something, we just can't really say that. So I'm always the opinion of I wouldn't speak in totalities quite like that. But anyway, he did say that he thinks the biggest mistake that PlayStation made initially was getting rid of Andrew House and Shawn Layden. Now right there again is an issue. Shawn Layden is one of those things where we have a lot of breadcrumbs throughout the years since he has left the company, in that it's never been fully said. He left the company very abruptly. Then he went on sabbatical for about a year. Now he's with Tencent advising. But otherwise, we've seen like these little breadcrumbs throughout the years of him liking tweets from people on Twitter about, oh, look at what PlayStation's turned into nowadays. Look at all the live service they're doing. Complaints about Jim Ryan and the current PlayStation leadership. And he likes all those tweets. You can sort of pick up what you're laying down there, in that it was probably not an amicable departure. Andrew House, I don't know why he's saying that. Andrew was with the company for 25-something years, and it was just one of those things where when you've got senior leadership there for that long and they leave and there's nothing that we are seeing after the fact, and Andrew wanted to pursue other personal things, like that just, it happens a lot in this sort of long-standing corporate structure. It's just not at all unusual to have somebody leave after nearly 30-something years at a company. And moreover, with consoles, and this is certainly true for other, tech corporations in general, in that with product teams and product launches, you don't want to be changing over leadership right in the middle of those key products launching. So you see a lot of these departures happen at very strategic moments. Ken Kutaragi leaving before PlayStation 4, Andy and Shawn leaving before PlayStation 5. Now Jim Ryan had left the company a little bit before what we assume is going to be PlayStation 6, and that's just a thing. I think it's more alarming when you have departures happen in a very abrupt manner in the middle of what we're expecting are new consoles launching, and with PlayStation 6 being, pretty far along in development, given the time when Jim Ryan left. Like that's my read on the situation. But either way, that was one point he mentioned as well, and that's sort of where, in his view, he thinks that's where PlayStation was starting to lose its way with that leadership, and he thinks that some new leadership should come in. But of course, a big part of this conversation is live service. So he was mentioning with Bungie, they paid $3.6 billion, and that was a console developer instead of a mobile publisher, because that's the other big point here, is that gaming is a $200+ billion business, and a small portion of that is PC, console, and the other $160+ billion is mobile live service. Why isn't Sony picking up a Zynga or Scopely or Niantic? Why aren't they picking up those businesses? Which honestly makes sense. I mean, there are points where I see where he's coming from, and that's not necessarily a bad take, I would say, especially in hindsight of what Bungie has turned into nowadays, and I think we all know exactly how that played out, which is buying them for live service expertise, Bungie lying about financials, bringing them in for their expertise, and realizing, oh man, you guys are actually a little bit in rough shape. And now where we are as of today with the most recent financial report is Bungie being fully integrated into PlayStation Studios, which was not necessarily meant to happen, because there was a contingency plan of you guys can remain independent if you are delivering on your own independence, which they were clearly not doing, right? I think we all can look back at Bungie now in hindsight and realize that didn't really play out the way PlayStation wanted it to play out. And that's not to say that PlayStation is always going to have these W's left and right. There are certainly going to be some missteps, and so that's what happened with the Bungie acquisition. But that's the point being made here, is that, well, if they're going to spend $3+ billion something, I don't know if Bungie, a console developer, that yes, they're talented people, but that might not have been the right play. Instead, it should have been mobile to finally have some sort of foothold in that marketplace, which, for those following the PlayStation business know, Sony has been really dropping the ball in that, more so than live service, just only because they've got nothing established for live service, period. Or, excuse me, mobile games, I should correct myself, although mobile and live service kind of go hand in hand, considering the kind of game that they would probably put out on mobile nowadays. But I think you get my point in that they made a formal establishment of PlayStation Studios Mobile. They've had some turnover with the leadership, and that team just can't really get off the ground. They can't quite source the right talent and get a studio off the ground. They did end up closing Neon Koi or Savage Game Studios. So you can see where they are nowadays, right, with the mobile segment. But again, I think a lot of people that are watching this channel wouldn't necessarily care about live service console games or mobile games or live service mobile games, if you understand my point there. The other thing that he does mention about the entire conversation, though, is simply that, again, PlayStation, have they lost their way? He feels that they did, obviously, but that's the weird thing about that question, or that rhetorical question of have they lost their way, when realistically, the most recent quarter shows they made $1 billion in operating income. PlayStation 5 on a launch line basis with PS4 is still doing incredibly well. It's only 2-something million consoles behind, but that is such a negligible small number. And the really eye-opening thing about how they're so close to PlayStation 4 on a launch line basis is that they are still doing that with a much higher average spend per console. PS5 has not seen any price drops, and in most cases has been increasing in price in certain markets. And then PlayStation 5 Pro coming in at $700, which is still probably a very profitable box for the company. And with how much money they're making from the PlayStation Store, with MTX and season passes and everything that all their third-party publishing partners are selling on the PlayStation Store, and now they are the de facto high-end console in this space, it's one of those things where you might be a very frustrated PlayStation fan with the lack of first-party output, which a lot of it can simply be chalked up to how long it takes to make games nowadays, and everybody is dealing with that. It's not a unique PlayStation problem, but a lot of disenfranchised PlayStation fans are, feeling that way despite how successful PlayStation has been. And that's where the disconnect probably is, as far as, has PlayStation lost their way? Well, their financials don't really say that at all. They've arguably found their way, which is being incredibly successful. On the other end, for a fan, that's where, some would agree. Maybe they have. And I'm kind of somewhere in the middle there, not to fence it, but it's always the points that I tend to make with PlayStation and their leadership nowadays, and how they've sort of grappled with this idea of, well, we have to invest in live service. How do we navigate that to the point where we hold on to single player games, which they still are trying to do, and they have been doing, in all fairness, given the 5+7 year dev cycle games. That alongside doing some live service, establishing some new studios, acquiring some new studios, a handful of existing teams that they did have are doing live service and feel a little bit committed and are pitching those games to the parent organization. You've got a lot of that going on. Sony has sort of walked away from smaller experiences, smaller bets, smaller development teams, with all the experimental things they used to do from, say, Japan Studio or on PlayStation Network. We all know about those games, but the argument I always make there is that they still align themselves with games like those. They just don't do them in-house anymore. And that's the thing that is maybe more semantic, because to me, I think we still have those games when they align themselves with them and they launch on PlayStation Plus, or if they do incubation programs like the China Hero, India Hero, Mina Hero Project. I think we still get these games. We just get them in a different manner. It really, maybe it does fall down to more of a semantic thing. And then there's also the case of Sony being much more open with experimenting in the multi-platform space, right? And we're still sort of seeing that develop over time, and it's still unknown as far as how far they'll really take that. Right now, they're getting as far as they've ever been with multi-platform, right? So really depends on who you ask when there's that rhetorical question of, has PlayStation lost their way? I think it's hard to say they have, looking at how well they're doing right now, although it's still always fair to be disappointed with PlayStation 5's output, the first-party output. And if you've been a long-standing PlayStation fan, then there's no denying that things are a lot different nowadays. But with that said, I'd be curious to see how people are feeling about this. I'm sure it's not going to be too much different from where it's been the last few years, but either way, we still have some game announcements coming up. It looks like September is going to have a State of Play or showcase, so we should have some things coming from PlayStation fairly soon. But anyway, that's about it for this conversation, and I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.